In the cold silence of Montana, a man visits an unmarked grave every Monday, carrying a single wildflower, and a secret buried deeper than the frozen ground beneath his feet. No one knows whose grave it is. No one dares to ask. Until one day, a woman arrives. She doesn't come for answers. She comes for revenge. But what happens when the man she came to destroy is not the monster she imagined? And what if the truth they're both hiding is the only thing that can save them? Stay with me, because this is not just a story about guilt. It's a story about truth, forgiveness, and the kind of love that grows from broken things. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, so we can keep telling stories that matter.
Every Monday morning for 4 years, Caleb Dunn walked out behind his smokehouse. He carried a single wildflower. He placed it on the dirt of an unmarked grave. He never spoke a name. He never told a living soul who lay beneath the earth. The woman who would finally ask him, the woman who would walk through his door on a cold September morning with a satchel of ledgers and a secret heavier than both of them, was the sister of the man he'd buried there. And she hadn't come to mourn. She had come to destroy him. This is the story of how a liar and a killer found a way to tell each other the truth, and how that truth, ugly, broken, and imperfect, became the only thing worth building a life on. Montana Territory, fall 1882. The air in Cedar Flat didn't just get cold, it got sharp. Caleb felt it in his lungs as he stepped off the back porch. 5 in the morning, pitch black. The frost crunching under his boots sounded like breaking glass. He held a sprig of goldenrod, walked past the barn, past the smokehouse, stopped at the mound of earth marked by a single smooth river stone. No carved letters, no dates. He stood there, 30 seconds, the wind whipping at his heavy wool coat. He didn't pray. Caleb figured God had stopped listening to him a long time ago. He just set the yellow flower on the frozen dirt, turned around, walked back. He'd been doing it for 4 years, every Monday. He planned to do it until he died. That was the oath, the one he'd sworn over her grave, except it wasn't her grave. And that is the first lie this story's going to tell you. Caleb lived a quiet life. Too quiet. 160 acres, 40 head of cattle, a 2-room log house that echoed when he dropped a spoon on the table. He had rules. Never sit with your back to the door. Write in the ledger every night. No whiskey, no saloon, no church. The town respected him. They tipped their hats. But they kept their distance. The kids in town called him Mr. Dunn. Never Caleb. He didn't just avoid talking. He avoided living. Doc Harlan noticed it. Doc noticed everything. He'd come up to the ridge a few days prior to check Caleb's lungs after a bad chest cold. Doc had packed his stethoscope, looked around the bare, joyless cabin, and sighed. "You know what scares me about you, Caleb," Doc had said. Caleb just looked at him. "A man who refuses every comfort in this world is one of 2 things," Doc said, leaning heavily on his cane. "He's either a saint, or he's a man punishing himself for something the rest of us don't know about. And I've been a doctor for 40 years, son. I have never met a saint." Caleb had poured the old man a cup of black coffee. "Then you've answered your own question, Doc," Caleb had said, "but you can't outrun the world forever. The world always sends a bill." For Caleb, the bill came on a Tuesday, a letter from the First Bank of Cedar Flat. Harold Whitaker, the bank president, had signed it himself, $340. Due in 90 days. If Caleb didn't pay, Whitaker was taking 40 acres, the best 40, the land with the creek access. Without that water, the rest of the ranch was just dry dirt. Caleb sat at his table. He stared at the numbers. He was a good man with a horse, a good man with a rope. He was terrible with numbers. His ledger was a mess of scratches and crossouts. If he sold his beef now, he'd starve in the spring. If he asked for an extension, Whitaker would laugh in his face. Whitaker hated him. Caleb had turned Whitaker's boy down for a deputy job back in Oregon years ago. The banker hadn't forgotten. Caleb knew the bank's math felt wrong. The interest seemed too high, but feeling it and proving it were two different things. If you've ever been backed into a corner where the numbers just don't add up, and there's nobody around to help you check the math, stay with me. Because what Caleb Dunn does next is what most of us wish we had the courage to do. And if this story is speaking to you already, tap that subscribe button. There's a lot more coming. Caleb rode into town the next day. He needed nails. He walked into the post office. Mrs. Pruitt was behind the counter sorting mail and minding everybody's business. Caleb didn't look at her. He looked at the bulletin board. There was a small piece of paper pinned to the cork. It had been there for 3 weeks, gathering dust. Experienced bookkeeper seeks position in rural area. Willing to work for room and board plus small wage. References available. Contact Miss E. Marlowe. General Delivery, Denver, Colorado. Mrs. Pruitt noticed him staring. That's been up since August, she said, leaning over the counter. Strange notice, if you ask me. A woman bookkeeper, willing to go anywhere. Either she's running from something, or she's running to something. Neither one is my business, of course. Caleb didn't answer. He bought his nails. He rode home. He thought about it for 3 days. On the third night, he sat down at his table. He lit the oil lamp. He pulled out a blank sheet of paper and dipped his pen. He didn't write a warm letter. He didn't write a polite one. Miss Marlowe, I have a ranch in Cedar Flat, Montana Territory. I need someone who can organize accounts and correspondence for 90 days. Room separate from main house. Wage, $3 weekly plus meals. Work is honest. Conditions are rough. If you can handle both, come before the first snow. C. Dunn. He sent the letter the next morning. On the ride back to the cabin, he stopped. He stood by the unmarked grave behind the smokehouse. For the first time in 4 years, Caleb spoke out loud. I'm letting a stranger into the house, Robert, he said. The wind took the words the second they left his mouth. First time since everything. I don't know why I'm telling you. Maybe because you're the only one who can't judge me for it. He walked back to the house. He opened his journal. September 11th, 1882, he wrote. Sent the letter. Don't know if she'll come. He set the pen down. He looked out the window at the empty yard. Hope she doesn't. She didn't just step off the stagecoach. She stepped into a plan. 4 months of planning, to be exact. Helena had been loud. The 2-day ride to Cedar Flat had been brutal. Dust in her teeth, cold seeping into the marrow of her bones. But Eliza didn't complain. She didn't flinch. When her boots hit the dirt outside the Cedar Flat post office, she was exactly who she needed to be. She wore black wool, frayed at the cuffs, faded at the hem. She had money in a bank in Denver. She could have bought silk. She could have bought velvet. But a woman in velvet doesn't need a job keeping books for $3 a week. A woman in velvet asks questions. A woman in tired wool just puts her head down and works. And Eliza needed to work. She needed to get inside Caleb Dunn's house. Everything about her was calculated. Her hair pulled back tight. Her satchel heavy but worn. Her weariness. She let it show on her face. 3 shades darker than she actually felt. She had learned a hard truth over the last 4 years. Nobody questions a desperate woman. They just look right past her. Caleb Dunn picked her up in a wagon. He didn't say much. He loaded her trunk. He clicked his tongue at the horses. Eliza sat beside him on the wooden bench. She watched him. Not like a woman watches a man. Like a hunter watches a print in the mud. She noted his hands. Rough, calloused. He held the reins loose, but his grip was steady. She noted his eyes. They never stopped moving, scanning the tree line, scanning the road, never resting. He's careful, she thought. He's been hunted before. This is going to take time. They arrived at the ranch just before sundown. The place was austere, 160 acres, a decent barn, a small log house, a side room built off the main cabin. He pointed to the side room. carried her trunk inside, set it down, left her alone. Eliza sat on the edge of the narrow cot. The silence of the place was heavy. It pressed against her ears. She didn't sleep much that night. She listened the next morning. This was the test. She needed to set the rules. She needed him to believe she was nothing more than a hired hand from Denver. She smoothed her dress, walked into the main cabin. The kitchen was already warm. The smell of strong coffee filled the air. Caleb was at the cast-iron stove. He was turning eggs in a skillet. Eliza stopped in the doorway. She had her words ready, a speech about her boundaries, about her expectations, about how she demanded respect despite her station. Caleb didn't let her speak. He turned around. He looked at her, not a passing glance, a deep anchoring look. He slid a tin plate onto the wooden table. He set a cup of black coffee next to it. He looked her dead in the eye, and he spoke. Eat, work, sleep. This house will not harm you. Stay. 10 words. Exactly 10 words. Then he turned back to the stove. Eliza stood frozen. The speech died in her throat. She had spent 4 months studying this man. Former deputy, disgraced, solitary, dangerous. But those 10 words, they weren't a threat. They weren't an order. They were a covenant. In a world where women were constantly explaining themselves, defending themselves, guarding themselves, this stranger had just handed her a shield. This house will not harm you. It knocked the wind out of her. It was the last thing she expected from the man she had come to ruin. She sat down. She drank the coffee. She ate the eggs. And for the first time since she stepped off the train in Montana, she felt a sliver of real warmth. It was a dangerous feeling. That night, Eliza made sure to kill it. The house was quiet. Caleb was asleep in the main room. Eliza locked the door to her side room. She pulled the curtains tight. She lit a single candle. She knelt beside her trunk. She didn't open the top. She pressed a hidden latch near the bottom hinge. The false bottom popped loose. She reached inside. She didn't pull out clothes. She didn't pull out keepsakes. She pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. She set it on the small wooden desk. Opened it to the first page. The handwriting was her own, sharp, precise. Case file. Caleb Dunn. Former Deputy Sheriff, Silver Falls, Oregon. Dismissed June 1879 after the death of Robert Morrison in custody. Eliza stared at the name. Robert Morrison, her brother, her blood. The man Caleb Dunn had killed. She flipped the page. Current debts, $340 to First Bank of Cedar Flat. Primary note purchased by E.M. through intermediary, July 1882. That was the secret in the trunk. The secret she carried across 3 state lines. She wasn't just Miss Marlowe, a traveling bookkeeper. She was Eliza Morrison, and she owned Caleb Dunn. When Robert's estate had finally settled, it wasn't much, but it was enough. She had used every dime she had, plus her own savings, to buy Caleb's debt from the bank in Cedar Flat. She was his creditor. She held the deed to his ruin in her hands. Objective: verify guilt. If guilty, foreclose and testify. If innocent, withdraw and return home. Eliza dipped her pen in the inkwell. She started a new entry. Day 1. Observation. Dunn appears composed, speaks minimally, seems unaware of my identity. He offered me safety today. It felt genuine. She paused. The ink dripped from the nib. She forced her hand to keep writing. Recommendation: maintain cover. Begin ledger audit immediately. Financial records reveal character. Do not allow personal feeling to interfere with the assessment. She closed the book. She remembered her mother's voice from a long time ago, before the sickness took her. Justice and revenge wear the same dress, Eliza. You have to check the stitching to tell them apart. Eliza blew out the candle. She lay in the dark. She listened to the wind rattle the window panes. She listened to the slow, steady breathing of the man through the wall. She had come for justice. She told herself that every night. But as she lay there, she wondered what she would do if the stitching started to fray. 2 weeks. That's how long it took her to make him feel like a damn fool. Not on purpose. That was the worst part. Eliza Marlowe didn't strut. She didn't brag. She just sat down at his table every morning, opened his disaster of a ledger, and went to work. Caleb had spent 4 years ignoring his books. He shoved receipts in a tin box. He crossed out numbers when he got confused. He was a man who understood the weight of a yearling calf, not the weight of compound interest. By the end of the first week, she had categorized 4 years of chaos. By the end of the second week, she had written replies to 12 letters he had ignored. She even caught the general store in town overcharging him for flour, $4.20. When she handed him the corrected tally, Caleb felt a hot flush of shame hit the back of his neck. He had let his life become a ruin. And it only took a stranger from Denver 14 days to clean it up. He wasn't impressed because she was pretty. He was impressed because she was competent. Deadly competent. It made him nervous. He tried to keep his distance. Eat, work, sleep. That was the deal. But living with a person is like water finding a crack in the rock. It gets in, no matter how tight you seal it. It started with a bee sting. Tuesday afternoon, warm for October. Eliza was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin. Caleb was oiling a bridle on the porch. He saw her jerk her hand back. She didn't scream. She didn't swear. She just gripped her wrist, her face pale, and walked quickly toward the house. Yellow jacket. Mean little bastards this time of year. Caleb put the bridle down. He walked inside. Eliza was at the sink, running cold water over her wrist. The skin was already swelling, red and angry. Caleb reached up to a high shelf. He pulled down a small amber jar. Honeysuckle resin. Old frontier remedy. Smelled like dirt and pine needles, but it worked. He walked over. He held the jar out. She reached for it. For a split second, her fingers brushed his. It was nothing. A fraction of an inch of skin. But they both pulled back like they'd touched a hot stove. Nobody looked at anybody. "It'll hurt for a day," Caleb said, his voice gravelly. "Won't kill you." Eliza took the jar. She looked at her swelling wrist. "Few things do, Mr. Dunn." Caleb stopped in the doorway. He looked back at her. That wasn't something a bookkeeper from a comfortable office in Denver said. That was something a survivor said, a woman who had taken a hit and kept walking. He filed that away. Then came the fever. Caleb had been out in the rain, pulling a calf out of the mud. He woke up the next morning shivering so hard his teeth clicked. He didn't say a word. He dragged himself out of bed. He chopped wood. He fed the stock. He moved slow, every joint aching. He expected her to fuss. Women usually fussed. They asked how you felt. They told you to lie down. They made a production out of it. Eliza didn't ask a single question. Around noon, he was sitting by the stove trying to get warm. Eliza walked out the back door. 10 minutes later, he heard a chicken squawk, then silence. She had killed the oldest hen. A tough decision on a frontier ranch. You don't waste meat. An hour later, there was a knock on his bedroom door. Just one knock. He opened it. A bowl of hot chicken broth sat on the floorboards, steam rising in the cold air. Eliza was already back at her desk, working. Caleb ate the soup. It was good, salty, rich. That night he wrote in his journal, "She didn't ask. First woman in 4 years who didn't ask me if I was all right. I'm grateful for that, in a way I can't explain." The third crack in the rock was the laugh. Jessie Ward was at the table for supper, 19 years old, Caleb's hired hand. Good kid, talked too much. Jessie was telling a story about Old Man Holloway's mule, a stupid story. The mule got stuck in a privy door. Caleb wasn't really listening. Then, it happened. Eliza laughed. It wasn't a polite giggle. It wasn't a ladylike chuckle. It was a real laugh, short, bright, surprised. It broke out of her chest and hit the walls of the cabin. Caleb froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. He hadn't heard a woman laugh in this house in 4 years. It didn't feel good. It hurt. It felt like someone taking a crowbar to a boarded-up window and letting the sun in. It made him realize how dark he'd let the room get. He looked down at his plate. He didn't eat another bite. While Caleb was fighting ghosts, Eliza was finding monsters. Real ones, with ink on their hands. She was deep in the bank records. Harold Whitaker's name was on every page. It took her 3 passes to catch it. The math was subtle. The original note stated 9% interest, standard for the territory. But starting 18 months ago, the compound calculations shifted. Just a fraction. It was hidden in the rolling balance. Whitaker was charging Caleb 11%. It wasn't a mistake. It was systemic. If the math was right, Caleb didn't owe $340. He owed $287. Whitaker was trying to bleed him out, pushing him into default to steal the creek water. Eliza sat back in her chair. She had a problem. If she told Caleb, he would ask how she caught it. He would realize she wasn't just a basic bookkeeper. She was a financial auditor. It would blow her cover. If she stayed quiet, she was letting a thief rob the man she was investigating. She made her choice. She drafted a letter, addressed to the Territorial Banking Commissioner in Helena. She detailed the math. She cited the dates. She signed it. A concerned citizen of Cedar Flat. She would mail it tomorrow. Caleb wouldn't know. Whitaker would get audited. It was a neat solution. But it made her stomach turn. She was protecting the man she came to destroy. That night, after Jesse went home, the cabin was quiet. The fire popped in the stove. Eliza was reading, a small, battered copy of Hawthorne. The Scarlet Letter. She chose it on purpose. She liked the irony. Caleb was sitting across the room. He was mending a broken leather strap with an awl and heavy thread. He didn't look up. His voice cut through the quiet. "Miss Marlowe." Eliza marked her page. "Yes, Mr. Dunn?" "You're too good for this." "Excuse me?" He pulled the heavy thread tight. "The books, the math. You're too skilled for a $3 wage in a dirt floor valley. Why aren't you at a bank in Denver? Or keeping books for a mining outfit? Why come out here?" Eliza didn't miss a beat. She had practiced this answer for a month. "Because banks in Denver don't hire women, Mr. Dunn, and mining companies want bookkeepers who will drink with the foreman after a long shift. Out here, my work speaks for itself. Nobody asks if a woman should be doing the math. They only care if the math is right." She delivered it perfectly, firm, a little indignant, plausible. Caleb stopped sewing. He looked at her, really looked. He didn't say she was lying. He didn't push. He just nodded once and went back to the leather strap. "Fair enough," he said quietly. Eliza went back to her book. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She thought she had won. But later, in his room, Caleb lit his lamp. He opened his journal. He picked up his pen. She answered too fast. Like she'd rehearsed it in a mirror, he stared at the words. "Nobody rehearses the truth. I don't know what she's lying about. I don't know if it matters. I've been lied to before." He paused. He thought about the honeysuckle. He thought about the chicken broth. He thought about her laugh. He dipped his pen one last time. "But this one tastes different. Every person carries what they carry. My job isn't to dig it up. My job is to notice the weight and try not to add to it. Cedar Flat was small. Small towns talk. It's what they do. They don't have theaters. They don't have orchestras. They have each other. And a stranger is the best kind of entertainment." Eliza knew this. She expected the whispers. She felt them when she walked into the general store. She felt them when she walked past the saloon. It was her 4th week at the Dunn Ranch. Most traveling bookkeepers stayed 5 days, maybe a week. They fixed the math, collected their pay, and got on the stagecoach. Eliza was still here. She walked into the post office on a Tuesday. Mrs. Pruitt was behind the counter, sorting envelopes. She stopped when the bell above the door chimed. "Morning, Miss Marlowe," Mrs. Pruitt said. Her voice was sweet. Too sweet, like syrup left out in the sun. "Good morning," Eliza said. "You're settling in real well out at Mr. Dunn's place. Nearly a month now. Must be a whole lot of numbers out there." "He had 4 years of backlog," Eliza said smoothly. "It takes time to do it right." "I suppose it does." Mrs. Pruitt smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. The door chimed again. Eliza turned. A woman walked in, late 30s, dressed in sensible gray cotton. She had a basket over her arm. Clara Dunlop. Eliza knew the name from the town records. Clara was a widow. She owned a small property bordering Caleb's land to the east. But Eliza knew something else. Something the records didn't say, but the shape of the woman's jaw screamed. Clara was Robert's older sister, Eliza's half-sister. They hadn't seen each other in 15 years, not since their mother's funeral. Eliza had been 12. Clara had been 17, already looking for a way out of a broken home. Clara stopped. She looked at Eliza. She didn't just look, she stared. "You're the bookkeeper," Clara said. "I am. Eliza Marlowe." Clara took a step closer. She tilted her head. Her eyes narrowed, searching Eliza's face. Searching the bones, searching the shape of the nose, the set of the mouth. Blood remembers blood, even when the mind forgets. "You look familiar, Miss Marlowe," Clara said quietly. "Have we met?" The air in the post office went dead. Eliza felt the blood stop in her veins. She felt cold, ice cold. If Clara recognized her, it was over. The plan, the investigation, all of it. Eliza forced her shoulders to relax. She forced a polite, empty smile onto her face. "I don't believe so, Mrs. Dunlop. I've never been to Montana before." Clara stared for another long second. Then she blinked. The moment broke. "My mistake," Clara said. She stepped up to the counter. "Just mail for me today, Hannah." Eliza took her own letters and walked out. She didn't breathe until she was a block away, back at the ranch, in the safety of her side room. Eliza sat on the edge of the cot. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the letters she had picked up. One was thick, postmarked Denver. Jonathan Greer, her lawyer. She tore the heavy paper open. "Miss Morrison, the estate matter is progressing. Tom Wheeler's contingent trust, the Morrison inheritance clause, remains unresolved. As a reminder, if the culpability of C. Dunn can be established by sworn affidavit before the next territorial circuit, the funds revert to you in full, approximately $3,800. If not established within 180 days of this letter, the funds revert to the Oregon Territorial Settlement Fund, per your late brother's residual clause. Advise on progress, J. Greer." $3,800. It was a fortune. It was 5 years' wages for a senior accountant in Denver. It was enough to buy her own firm, enough to never depend on a man or a bank or a brother ever again. All she had to do was prove Caleb Dunn was a murderer. She folded the letter. She slid it under the leather mat on her desk. She closed her eyes, and the ghost came. It always did. July, 1879, Denver, Colorado. A hot, dusty afternoon. Eliza was 22, working as a junior clerk, barely making rent. There was a knock on her boarding house door. It was Robert. He looked tired. His suit was dusty, but he had that smile. That same easy, reckless smile that always made people forgive him. "Lizzie," he had said. He took her to dinner. He bought her steak. He poured the wine. Then he asked for the money. He asked for $200, Robert said, leaning across the table. His eyes were wide, earnest. "Just for a month, Lizzie. I've got a land deal in Oregon, Silver Falls. It's huge. But I need cash to float the surveyor fees until the government stamps the deeds." Eliza had looked at him. She was an accountant. She understood money, and she understood when numbers were a lie. "The deeds aren't stamped?" she asked. Robert waved a hand. "Formality. The Nez Perce Treaty cleared the land. It's just paperwork. But the settlers are ready to buy now. If I don't close, someone else will." He was looking away, looking at the tablecloth, looking at his glass, never looking in her eyes. She knew. Deep in her gut, she knew he was lying. She knew the land wasn't his to sell. She knew he was running a scam. He was floating undeeded land to desperate people. If she said no, his scheme would collapse. He would have to go home. He would fail. But he was her brother. He was the only family she had left in the world. When their parents died, Robert had paid her rent. He had bought her winter coats. She loved him, and love makes you a coward. 200, she had said. That's everything I have, Robert. I'll pay you back 300, he promised. A month. I swear it, Lizzie. She went to the bank the next morning. She withdrew the money. She handed it to him. 2 weeks later, Robert was arrested in Silver Falls. 3 days after that, he was dead in a jail cell. Eliza opened her eyes. The Montana wind rattled the window pane. The truth she had buried for 4 years was clawing its way out of the dirt. She hadn't just ignored Robert's crime. She had funded it. Her $200 kept him in Silver Falls. Her $200 allowed him to sell 3 more plots of fake land. She helped ruin those families. When the news came that Robert was dead, killed by a heavy-handed deputy, Eliza had collapsed. But it wasn't just grief. It was guilt. She couldn't live with the guilt. So she built a story. She told herself Robert was an innocent victim, a good man murdered by a bad lawman. She told herself she came to Cedar Flat for justice, for Robert. It was a lie. She opened her private journal, not the case file, her own book. She picked up the pen. Her hand felt heavy, like it was made of lead. I told myself I came here for Robert. That was the first lie. Psst. Then I told myself I came here for justice. That was the second. She stared at the wet ink. The truth is, I came here to find out if I was responsible. Because if Caleb Dunn didn't kill Robert, then someone had to. And the only other candidate is the sister who knew he was drowning and handed him a heavier stone. She dropped the pen. She put her face in her hands. If Caleb Dunn was a monster, she was safe. She was the grieving sister of a murdered man. But what if he wasn't? What if Caleb Dunn was just a man who made a mistake? If Caleb wasn't the devil, then she couldn't hide anymore. She heard footsteps in the main cabin, heavy boots. Caleb coming in from the barn. She listened to him walk to the stove, lift the coffee pot, set it down. She was running out of time. Sunday. Out here, Sunday wasn't about church. It was about survival. It was the one day a man didn't break his back trying to make the dirt owe him a living. You fed the stock, you checked the fences, but you didn't chop wood, you didn't mend the roof. You let your bones rest. Caleb woke up at 5:30. Habit. The cabin was freezing. The fire in the stove had burned down to gray ash. He pulled on his pants, his thick wool shirt, his boots. He opened his bedroom door and walked into the kitchen. He stopped. The air was warm. The stove was ticking, freshly fed with split pine, and the coffee was hot. It was sitting on the cast-iron surface, steaming. Eliza was nowhere to be seen. Her door was closed. She had woken up before him. She had built the fire. She had brewed the coffee. And then she had gone back to her room. She had waited for him, without waiting for him. She knew how he liked his mornings. He liked them quiet. He liked them alone. Most people try to fill empty space. They think if 2 people are in a house, they have to be talking. They have to be looking at each other. Eliza didn't do that. Caleb poured a cup, black, bitter, perfect. He sat down at his spot at the table. He looked out the frosted window at the rising sun. It was the first Sunday in 4 years he hadn't made his own coffee. It was a small thing. But to a man who had built a fortress out of routine, a small thing is a battering ram. Mid-morning. The sun burned the frost off the tall grass. Caleb walked out the back door. He headed toward the north ridge. He needed to check the barbed wire along the creek line. He walked slow. The air was crisp, smelled like pine needles and cold water. He came over the crest of the hill. Down below, by Cedar Creek, he saw her. Eliza. She was walking along the bank. She wore her heavy black coat. Her head was bare. Her dark hair was catching the autumn light. Caleb stopped. He should have turned around. He should have given her the space, but his boots kept walking, down the hill, toward the water. She heard him coming, the crunch of dry grass. She stopped. She turned and looked at him. He stopped about 10 feet away. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask what she was doing. He just found a fallen cottonwood log. He brushed the frost off it. He sat down. Eliza looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the creek. She found a flat, sun-warmed river rock. She sat down, 8 feet between them. The creek moved over the stones, a low, constant rush of water. The cottonwood trees were turning, bright yellow leaves. Every time the wind blew, they dropped like gold coins onto the surface of the water, floating away downstream. 10 minutes passed. Neither of them spoke. A mule deer stepped out of the brush on the opposite bank, a young doe. She walked down to the water. She dipped her head, drank. She looked up. She saw Caleb. She saw Eliza. The deer didn't run. She didn't smell fear. She didn't sense danger. She just chewed a mouthful of dry grass, watched them for a minute, and then ambled back into the trees. Caleb kept his eyes on the water. His chest felt strangely light. Every woman he had ever known, his mother, his sisters, the girl he almost married when he was 20. They all needed him to fill the silences. They needed him to entertain, to reassure, to prove he was there. Eliza Marlowe sat in silence like it was a room she had lived in her whole life. She didn't demand a piece of him. She didn't require him to perform. She just let him be. He realized, sitting on that log, that silence didn't have to be a punishment. It didn't have to be a cage you locked yourself inside because you were afraid of what you might say. Sometimes silence was just peace. Late afternoon. The sun was dropping behind the Bitterroot Mountains. The sky was bruising purple and orange. Jesse had gone into town to see his mother. The ranch was completely empty. Just Caleb and Eliza. Caleb was on the porch. He had an old piece of harness leather. He was rubbing neat's foot oil into it with a rag. Eliza came out. She had her book, the battered copy with the worn spine. She sat down in the wooden rocker at the far end of the porch, 6 feet away. She opened the book. She started to read. Caleb worked the oil into the leather. The rhythmic shh of the rag, the creak of the rocking chair. Without thinking, without looking up, Eliza read a line out loud. She had wandered without rule or guidance into a moral wilderness. She stopped, her voice caught. She realized she had spoken. She looked up, her cheeks flushing slightly. She opened her mouth, probably to apologize for disturbing him. Caleb didn't look up from the leather. "Hawthorne," he said. Eliza blinked. "Excuse me?" "That's Nathaniel Hawthorne," Caleb said. His voice was rough from disuse, but steady. Eliza stared at him. The mountain man. The quiet, brooding rancher with dirt under his fingernails and blood in his past. "You've read him?" she asked. Caleb finally looked over at her. "My mother was a school teacher back in Ohio," he said. "She read aloud every night. I didn't go to a proper school for long, had to work the farm. But I read every book she owned." He looked back down at his hands. "Twice." Eliza didn't ask another question. She didn't push. She didn't make a big deal out of the fact that he had just handed her a piece of his childhood. A piece of his real self. She just nodded. She looked back down at her book, and then she started to read aloud. Not by accident this time. On purpose. Her voice was clear, rhythmic. Caleb kept oiling the leather. He didn't say thank you. He didn't nod. He just listened. He listened until the light was gone and the words faded into the dark. Monday morning, 5 in the morning, pitch black. Caleb walked out behind the smokehouse. The frost was heavier today. Winter was coming fast. He held a sprig of purple aster, a late autumn flower. He stopped at the unmarked grave. He placed the flower on the stone. He stood there. The wind bit at his face. He looked down at the dirt. And he spoke. "Robert," his voice sounded loud in the empty yard. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. Probably because there's nobody else to tell." He shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets. "There's a woman in the house. She reads Hawthorne on Sundays. She doesn't fill up the quiet with noise. She makes the place feel like a house again." He swallowed hard. His throat was tight. "And I'm afraid of that." He looked up at the black sky. The stars were sharp and cold. The last time a house felt like a home, I burned it to the ground. Not with fire, with what I did, with what I couldn't stop from happening. He looked back down at the stone. I don't know if I'm allowed to have another home. I don't know if you'd want me to. But if you're listening, if there's any part of you still listening. He closed his eyes. I want you to know I never meant it. I never meant for it to happen. He stood there for another minute. He let the wind take the words away. He turned and walked back to the cabin. When he opened the back door, the kitchen was warm. The smell of bacon and coffee hit him. Eliza was at the stove. She turned around as he walked in. She looked at his face. She looked at the cold clinging to his coat. She didn't ask where he had been. But for a second, just a fraction of a second, Caleb saw something in her eyes. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't pity. It looked almost like she knew exactly where he had been, like she knew exactly who he was talking to. Week 6. The math was done. Eliza sat at the small desk in her room. She rubbed her eyes. The ledger was balanced. She had found every missing penny. She had tracked every receipt. And she had confirmed what she suspected 2 weeks ago. Harold Whitaker was stealing from Caleb Dunn, systematically, quietly, bleeding him dry with compound interest. But proving the bank was corrupt didn't help her. It didn't serve her plan. She needed proof of a different kind. She needed something that told her what kind of man Caleb was when the law wasn't looking. A man's ledger tells you what he values, but a man's secrets tell you who he is. Thursday morning, Caleb took the wagon into Cedar Flat for grain. He would be gone for at least 3 hours. Jessie had the day off to help his mother fix her roof. Eliza had the ranch to herself. She didn't stay in the cabin. She walked out to the barn. It was cold inside. Smelled of sweet hay, horse sweat, old leather. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the roof slats. She walked past the stalls, past the tack room. In the far back corner, beneath a pile of old moth-eaten horse blankets, she saw a wooden crate. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it was forgotten, pushed away. The dust on the tarp covering it was an inch thick. Eliza pulled the tarp back. She coughed as the dust plumed into the air. It was a heavy lockbox, iron hinges, rusted shut. But the padlock was missing. The clasp was just pushed down. She hesitated. Opening a man's ledger was business. Opening his private box was a violation. She thought of Robert. She thought of the letter from her lawyer in Denver. $3,800. The estate. She unlatched the clasp. She pushed the heavy lid back. Inside it wasn't gold, it wasn't weapons, it was paper, bundles of letters, court documents, tied together with brittle twine. She reached in. Her fingers brushed the top bundle. The paper was dry, yellowed at the edges. She pulled out a small, dark blue booklet. A bank book. Not from the First Bank of Cedar Flat, from the First National Bank of Portland, Oregon. Eliza opened it. She expected to see a few dollars. Emergency funds, maybe 100. Her eyes traced the last entry in the column. $2,147. Eliza stopped breathing. She stared at the number. She traced the ink with her finger. It didn't change. $2,000. It was a fortune. It was enough to pay off Whitaker's fraudulent debt 6 times over. It was enough to buy another 300 acres of prime grazing land. It was enough to build a new house, buy a new herd, and live comfortably for 5 years. Caleb wasn't broke. He was rich. By frontier standards, he was a wealthy man. So why was he eating thin soup? Why was he freezing in a drafty cabin? Why was he letting a corrupt banker threaten to take the only land he worked? She dug deeper into the box. She found a letter. Heavy parchment, official seal, dated March 1880, Salem, Oregon. She unfolded it. The handwriting was sharp. Legal script. Mr. Dunn, the district court has ruled in your favor on the matter of wrongful dismissal. Silver Falls Municipality is ordered to pay damages of $2,000 plus accrued interest. These funds are payable annually through the Oregon Territorial Settlement Fund. The first payment has been deposited to your account at First National Bank of Portland as requested. Congratulations on clearing your name. H. Broderick, Esquire. Eliza read it twice, then a third time. The pieces fell into place. The picture they formed was devastating. Caleb had been fired after Robert died. The town turned on him. But Caleb had fought back. He had hired a lawyer. He had sued the town of Silver Falls for wrongful termination. And he had won. A judge had looked at the facts and declared Caleb had been wronged. The town had to pay him out of their own tax funds, but Caleb never touched the money. The bank book showed the annual deposits. It showed the interest compounding, but it showed 0 withdrawals, not one single penny. Eliza slowly sat back on her heels. The cold of the dirt floor seeped through her wool skirt. She understood. God help her, she understood. The money came from the town of Silver Falls, the town where Robert died, the town where 20 families lost their life savings because of her brother's lies. To Caleb, it wasn't a settlement, it was blood money. To spend that money would mean accepting that he was innocent. It would mean telling himself that he deserved to profit from a tragedy. His conscience wouldn't allow it. He would rather lose his ranch. He would rather freeze. He would rather starve than buy a loaf of bread with a coin that came from Silver Falls. Eliza put the letter back. She put the bank book back. She closed the heavy wooden lid. She pulled the tarp over it. She stood up. Her legs felt weak. She walked out of the barn. The sunlight felt too bright. The air felt too thin. She went to her room. She locked the door. She pulled out her personal journal. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen. She started to write. A guilty man hides his money. He spends it quietly, in small amounts, in towns where nobody knows his name. She stared at the wet ink. A wounded man who believes himself guilty does something different. He refuses to touch it at all. He chooses cold nights and thin soup over the comfort that comes from a town he believes he wronged. A tear dropped onto the page. The ink blurred. Eliza didn't wipe her eyes. She kept writing. Caleb Dunn is not pretending. He is not performing for an audience. He is doing a penance so complete, so brutal, that it has calcified into the shape of his life. I came here to prove he deserved it. I came here to find a guilty man. I may have found a good one. She dropped the pen. It clattered against the desk. She buried her face in her hands. If Caleb was a monster, she could finish what she started. She could foreclose on his land. She could take the estate money. She could go back to Denver and finally sleep. But if he was innocent? If he was a good man broken by a terrible mistake? Then the only person in this story who needed judgment was her. She was the one who funded Robert's lies. She was the one who hid in the dark while a good man punished himself in the light. Late afternoon. The sun was dropping fast. The temperature plummeted. Caleb was back. The wagon was unloaded. He was sitting on the back porch. He had an awl in his hand. He was fixing a broken leather strap. It was what he did when he needed to think. The repetitive motion, the smell of oil, it anchored him. Eliza opened the back door. She stepped out onto the porch. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders. She didn't say anything. She just walked over to the wooden chair opposite him. And she sat down. She didn't have a book this time. She didn't have a ledger. She just sat there, looking at him, looking at the rough hands that refused to touch a fortune out of pure, stubborn honor. Caleb didn't look up right away. He kept working the awl through the tough hide. Finally, he stopped. He looked across the porch at her. He saw the redness around her eyes. He saw the tension in her jaw. "Bad day?" he asked. His voice was quiet. Eliza looked at him. Really looked at him. "Long one," she said. Caleb nodded. He didn't pry. He didn't ask her to explain. He just picked up the awl and went back to work. They sat together as the sun went down. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy. It was full of things that couldn't be said. He didn't ask, Eliza thought. That was his gift. I didn't tell. That was my theft. Week 8. The sky above the Bitterroot Mountains was the color of bruised iron. Winter wasn't just coming, it was here. Doc Harlan rode up the long dirt drive. He didn't bring his buggy. He rode his old roan gelding. The horse was blowing hard, white steam flaring from its nostrils in the freezing air. Doc didn't have his black medical bag. Caleb was by the woodpile splitting pine. He saw Doc coming. He brought the axe down, burying the blade deep in the chopping block. He walked over to meet the old man. "Doc, you're pushing that animal hard for a Tuesday." Doc dismounted. He moved stiffly. His joints hated the cold. "Make some coffee, Caleb," Doc said. "Strong." They sat in the kitchen. Eliza was in her side room. The door was closed. But Caleb knew she could hear. The walls were thin. Doc wrapped his weathered hands around the tin cup. He didn't drink. He just let the heat seep into his bones. "I got a letter yesterday," Doc said. He stared into the black liquid. "From an old friend down in Portland." Caleb didn't say anything. He just sat still. "My friend is a judge," Doc continued. "He said a lawyer from Denver has been asking questions. Asking about you, asking about Silver Falls, asking about a man named Robert Morrison." Doc finally looked up. His eyes were sharp beneath his bushy white eyebrows. "His name is Jonathan Greer. He represents the Morrison estate, and he is digging up the whole damn graveyard, Caleb. He's pulling court transcripts. He's talking to the territorial governor." Caleb's face didn't change. Not a muscle twitched. He had been waiting for this. For 4 years, he had known the past was a hound that never stopped running. "Who hired him?" Caleb asked. His voice was flat. "Greer won't say," Doc replied, but estates don't investigate on their own. Not after 4 years. Somebody with a personal stake is paying the bill. Somebody wants blood. Doc leaned forward. "Someone is coming for you, Caleb. If they aren't already here, they're coming." Caleb looked past Doc. He looked at the closed door of the side room. He looked at it for a long time. "Let them come," Caleb said. That afternoon, Caleb saddled his horse. He told Jesse he was riding out to the south pasture to check a broken fence line. He needed to be alone. He needed the wind in his face. Doc stayed behind. He was sitting on the porch smoking a pipe. Jesse walked out of the barn. He wiped grease off his hands with a rag. The 19-year-old boy looked at the doctor. Then he looked out at the horizon where Caleb had disappeared. Jesse had worked on the Dunn Ranch for 2 years. He had never asked questions. It wasn't the frontier way. But today the silence was too heavy. "Doc," Jesse said, walking over to the porch. Doc puffed on his pipe. "Yeah, son?" "Who was Robert Morrison?" Doc stopped puffing. He took the pipe out of his mouth. "I've heard the name," Jesse said quickly. "Mrs. Pruitt whispers it. Old man Halloway talks about it when he's deep in his cups. I've never asked Caleb. Didn't feel right. But if trouble is coming, I'd rather know what kind." Doc looked at the boy. Jesse was a good kid, honest, worked hard. Maybe it was time somebody else knew the truth. "Sit down, Jesse," Doc said. Jesse sat on the porch steps. Doc tapped his pipe against the railing. "Robert Morrison was a businessman down in Silver Falls, Oregon," Doc began. His voice took on the cadence of an old storyteller. "He was charming, he was handsome, and he was a liar." Doc looked out at the mountains. Year was 1878. Robert sold land to 20 families, mostly immigrants. Desperate folks looking for a fresh start. He sold them prime acreage in the Silver River Valley. "What's wrong with that?" Jesse asked. "The land wasn't his to sell," Doc said. "It was contested territory. Tied up in federal courts after the Nez Perce War. Robert knew it. He sold it anyway. Took their life savings. $80 here, $200 there. Took everything they had." Jesse frowned. "That's stealing." "Worse than stealing," Doc said. "It's murder by starvation. When the government ruled on the land a year later, the deeds were declared void. Those 20 families lost everything. No land, no money, nothing to go back to. I saw kids sleeping in wagons in the mud." Doc took a slow breath. The territorial marshal issued a warrant for Robert's arrest. Caleb was the town deputy. He knew Robert. Silver Falls was a small place. Everybody knew everybody. Doc looked down at his hands. Caleb went to bring him in, but Caleb wasn't just wearing a badge that day. He was carrying the grief of 20 ruined families. He was angry. Robert fought back. He resisted. Caleb didn't pull his gun, but he used his hands. Jesse went very still. Caleb threw him against the cell bars, hard, too hard. Robert went down, hit his head on the cement floor. "Did he die right there?" Jesse asked softly. "No," Doc said. "He was conscious. He was talking, cursing Caleb out." Caleb locked the door and went home. He thought Robert was just bruised, just a stubborn drunk. Doc shook his head. "I was practicing in Silver Falls back then. I got the call the next morning. Robert couldn't stand up, couldn't speak his wife's name. Subdural hematoma, bleeding inside the skull. The pressure crushed his brain. He died 3 days later." Jesse stared at the dirt. "It was an accident." "The law said it was," Doc agreed. "A jury cleared Caleb, said he was doing his duty, said the force wasn't malicious, but a jury can't give a man his soul back. Caleb believed he killed a man out of anger. He believed if he had checked on Robert in the night, I might have been able to drill the skull, relieve the pressure, save his life." Doc sighed. The town split in half. The ruined families called Caleb a hero. The rest of the town called him a murderer. Caleb turned his badge in. He packed his bags. He rode out here. Jesse sat in silence for a long time. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin. "Doc," Jesse said finally. His voice was tight. "There's a grave out behind the smokehouse. Caleb puts a flower on it every Monday." Doc nodded slowly. "Who is it?" Jesse asked. Doc looked at the boy. He decided to give him the whole truth. "When Robert died," Doc said quietly, "his wife wouldn't claim the body. The scandal was too great. She was pregnant. She couldn't face the town burying her husband as a criminal. Robert's sister was far away in Denver, barely a girl. So the town council voted to toss the body in a pauper's grave, a ditch outside the cemetery limits." Doc leaned forward. "Caleb found out. He went to the morgue. He took his final paycheck, every penny he had left in the world, and he bought a pine box. He paid the railroad to ship that box to Montana, and he buried Robert Morrison on his own land." Jesse stared at the doctor, his eyes wide. "He buried him unmarked," Doc said, "because he didn't want the man to lie in a ditch in shame, and every Monday he puts a flower on that dirt, because nobody else ever will." Jesse swallowed hard. "Does Miss Marlowe know?" Doc looked toward the cabin, toward the closed door. "I don't know what Eliza Marlowe knows," Doc said. "But I'll tell you this, son. That woman reads a hell of a lot more than ledgers. She watches Caleb like a hawk watching a field mouse. Whatever she came to Cedar Flat for, it isn't bookkeeping." That night, the wind was screaming outside. Snow mixed with freezing rain lashed against the windows. The fire roared in the stove. Caleb sat in his chair. Eliza sat on the small sofa. They weren't working. They weren't reading. They were just sitting in the warmth. Caleb looked at the fire, the flames reflected in his dark eyes. He knew the storm was coming. Not the snowstorm, the other one, the one wearing a badge or a suit. He looked over at Eliza. She was staring into the flames too. Her face was pale. She looked exhausted. He opened his mouth. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to warn her. He wanted to say, "There is blood on my hands, and the law is coming to collect." But he looked at her eyes, and again he saw it. He didn't see a woman who needed a warning. He saw a woman who looked like she was carrying the exact same weight he was. He closed his mouth. He leaned forward. He rested his elbows on his knees. "Miss Marlowe," he said. His voice cut through the crackle of the burning wood. Eliza looked at him. "Yes, Caleb?" She didn't call him Mr. Dunn. The formality had slipped away somewhere in the last 8 weeks. "If someone ever comes up that drive," Caleb said slowly, "a lawman, a lawyer, a stranger asking questions." He held her gaze. He didn't blink. I need you to promise me one thing." Eliza's heart pounded against her ribs. She kept her face perfectly still. "What is it?" "Don't lie for me," Caleb said. The words hit the room like stones hitting the floor. "Whatever they ask you," Caleb continued, his voice rough, "you tell them the truth, the absolute truth. You tell them what you see. You tell them what you know." He sat back in his chair. "I've had enough people lie on my behalf. It doesn't make anything better. It just makes the rot go deeper." Eliza looked at him, at the absolute, unbending honesty in his eyes. She felt a physical ache in her chest. She was the lie. She was the rot. "I promise," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Caleb nodded. He believed her. He stood up. He walked to his room. He closed the door. Eliza sat by the fire. They were both playing a game. They were both pretending the world wasn't about to end. But out in the dark, the snow was falling, and the tracks were already laid. Week 10. The first real snow came down in sheets. It didn't drift. It drove, hard and sideways, biting the skin like crushed glass. Caleb was in the barn, pitching hay. Eliza was on the porch, shaking out a heavy wool rug. That's when the rider came up the drive. He rode a big roan. He wore a heavy canvas slicker, and pinned to his chest, catching the gray morning light, was a silver star, United States Marshal. Caleb walked out of the barn. He didn't reach for a rifle. He didn't look surprised. He just stood in the snow, waiting. The marshal pulled his horse up. He tipped his hat. Professional, no hostility. "Caleb Dunn?" "That's me." The marshal reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper. "I'm not here to arrest you, Mr. Dunn, but I am serving you with a summons. District Court of Montana Territory. A petition has been filed regarding the death of Robert Morrison in Silver Falls, Oregon." Caleb took the paper. He didn't look at it. "Judge Parsons will be holding circuit court in Cedar Flat in 14 days, the marshal said. "You are ordered to appear on November 21st to give testimony. Failure to appear results in a bench warrant. You have the right to secure counsel. Good day, sir." The marshal turned his horse. He rode back down the drive. Caleb stood in the snow. Eliza stood on the porch. The rug hung forgotten from her hands. Caleb turned. He looked at her. He didn't look afraid. He just looked incredibly, impossibly tired. He folded the paper, put it in his pocket, walked back into the barn. Eliza didn't wait. She took the wagon into Cedar Flat an hour later. She told Caleb she needed flour. She didn't go to the general store. She went straight to the Justice of the Peace. The territorial records were public. Anyone could look at them. She stood at the high wooden counter. The clerk, a thin man with ink on his fingers, slid the ledger across the wood. Eliza found the docket for the November circuit. She ran her finger down the page. She found Caleb's name. Her breath hitched. She looked at the column next to it. The name of the petitioner. The person who had filed the grievance. Petitioner. Clara J. Dunlop. Née Morrison. Relationship to deceased. Sister. Eliza stared at the ink. Clara. The widow. The neighbor. The woman who had come into the post office and stared at her face. Clara wasn't just a neighbor. She was Robert's sister, Eliza's sister, and she had lived next to Caleb Dunn for 3 years. She had known who he was the whole time. Eliza felt the floor tilt beneath her boots. Clara had been waiting, watching him, waiting for a reason to strike. And Eliza realized with a sickening drop in her stomach that she was the reason. Clara had watched Caleb start to open up. She had watched him smile at the market. She had watched another woman bring life back into his eyes. And Clara couldn't stomach it. He gets to be happy while Robert rots in the dirt? Eliza closed the ledger. She walked out into the cold. She marched straight down the edge of town toward the small, neat house with the white painted trim. She knocked on Clara's door, hard. Clara opened it. She looked at Eliza standing on the porch, covered in snow. Clara didn't look surprised. "Come in," Clara said quietly. Eliza stepped inside. The house was warm, smelled like cinnamon and old wood. Clara walked to the stove. She poured 2 cups of tea. She set them on the table. "Sit," Clara said. Eliza sat. Clara sat across from her. She looked at Eliza's face. She didn't look away this time. "You're Robert's sister," Clara said. "Eliza. I saw you once. You were 12, at Mother's funeral. You probably didn't remember me." "I remember now," Eliza said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. Clara took a sip of her tea. "You came here to find him guilty," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I came to this valley to watch him live," Clara said. Her voice was hollow, empty. "I moved here 3 years ago. I thought if I stayed close enough, if I watched him long enough, I would see his conscience crack. I would see him fall apart. I would see him pay." Clara looked out the window, toward the Dunn ranch. "But he didn't fall apart. He just kept being careful, kept being decent, kept walking out to that unmarked grave every single Monday." Clara looked back at Eliza. Her eyes were bright with tears. "Do you know I've watched him do that for 3 years, Eliza? From my kitchen window every Monday. And I hated him for it. Because a murderer shouldn't grieve. A murderer should forget." Eliza felt a lump rise in her throat. "He hasn't forgotten." "No, he hasn't," Clara said bitterly. "And that's the part I can't forgive. Because if he's carrying the guilt this well, then either he is the best actor on God's green earth, or he didn't kill Robert the way I needed him to have killed him. And I don't know which of those truths I can survive." Eliza sat in silence. She understood. God help her. She completely understood. Clara didn't want revenge, not really. She wanted permission to grieve. The town had told her to move on. They said Robert was a scandal, a crook. They told her to be quiet. But Robert was her brother. She had a right to mourn him. She had a right to demand answers. "I'm sorry, Clara," Eliza whispered. Clara closed her eyes. "So am I." Eliza drove the wagon back to the ranch. The snow was falling heavier now, covering the tracks, covering the dirt. It was time. She couldn't carry the lie for another hour. The weight of it was breaking her spine. She pulled the wagon into the barn. She unhitched the horses. She walked out into the yard. Caleb was sitting on the back porch. He didn't have a jacket on. He was just sitting on the wooden steps, letting the snow fall on his shoulders. He was waiting for her. Eliza walked up. She didn't go inside. She stood in front of him. She pulled her gloves off. She dropped them in the snow. "My name is not Eliza Marlowe," she said. Her voice rang out in the quiet yard, crisp, clear. "My name is Eliza Morrison. Robert Morrison was my brother." Caleb didn't move. He didn't flinch. "When he died," Eliza continued, the words spilling out of her, "I was 22. I was alone in Denver. I was told that a deputy named Caleb Dunn beat him to death in a jail cell. I have lived with that story for 4 years." She took a ragged breath. "When Robert's estate settled, there was a clause. I would inherit $3,800, but only if I could prove his death was wrongful. I used my own money to buy your debt from First Bank. I am your creditor, Caleb. The money you owe it to me." She looked at him, waiting for the anger, waiting for the disgust. "I came here to investigate you. I answered your notice with a false name. Every question I asked, every ledger I audited, every night I sat by your fire. It was research. I was building a case against you." She stopped. She was empty. She had laid all her sins out in the snow. "Everything I have told you about myself is a lie," she whispered. "Everything except that I read Hawthorne on Sundays. That part was real." The silence stretched. The wind howled through the pine trees. Caleb slowly stood up. He brushed the snow off his thighs. He looked down at her. He didn't look angry. He just looked sad. "I know," Caleb said. Eliza froze. "What?" "I've known since your 3rd week here." Eliza stared at him. Her mind couldn't grasp it. "How?" "You look at Robert's grave the same way I do," Caleb said softly. "Like somebody who owes the dead an answer. A stranger doesn't look at dirt like that. Only family does. I wrote to an old friend in Silver Falls. He said Robert's widow remarried and moved to Sacramento. So you weren't her. Caleb took a step closer. That left the sister, the one Robert talked about sometimes, a bookkeeper down in Denver. I figured it out a month ago. Eliza felt the tears finally spill over her cold cheeks. And you didn't throw me out. Why? Why did you let me stay? Caleb reached out. He didn't touch her face. He just picked up her discarded gloves from the snow. He handed them to her. I wanted to see what you would do, Caleb said. I wanted to know what kind of person Robert's sister was. I decided you were someone who had lost a lot more than she could admit. He looked toward the unmarked grave. And I decided, if you ever found the courage to tell me the truth, I would finally tell you mine. He turned back to the cabin. He opened the door. Come inside, Eliza, you're freezing. They didn't sleep. The storm hammered the roof. The wind screamed down the chimney. They sat in the main room. Caleb built the fire up until the cast-iron stove glowed dull red in the dark. He boiled coffee. He handed Eliza a heavy wool blanket. She wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. She was shivering, but not from the cold. Caleb sat in the wooden rocker. He leaned forward. You want to hear what happened, he said. Yes? It won't make you feel better. Eliza looked at him. I'm not looking to feel better, Caleb. I'm looking to know. Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. The rough, calloused hands that had held a badge, held a rope, and held a man down. He didn't make excuses. He didn't dress it up. Robert came to the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning, Caleb began. His voice was low, rhythmic, like a drum beat in the quiet room. He'd been tipped off that the territorial warrant was out. He could have run. He had a fast horse. He came in instead. I think he wanted to explain. I think he thought he could talk his way out of it. Caleb shook his head. I didn't let him. I'd been talking to the families, the 20 families who lost everything. I'd sat with a woman named Mrs. Abernathy. She had 3 kids sleeping in a wagon in the mud. I'd listened to them cry. I'd carried their stories in my gut for 3 weeks. He looked up at Eliza. His eyes were dark, haunting. When Robert walked in, I was not a peace officer. I was a man who was angry. Eliza gripped the edges of the blanket. I told him to turn around, Caleb said. He tried to talk. He said, Caleb, let me explain. I grabbed his wrist to put the irons on him. He pulled back. Caleb swallowed hard. He wasn't a big man. He wasn't dangerous. He was just scared. He pulled back, and I yanked him forward. Harder than I needed to. I wanted to show him who was in charge. He went off balance. He hit the edge of the heavy oak desk as he fell. Then he hit the floor. The room was dead silent except for the fire. He was conscious, Caleb said softly. He was talking. He was cursing at me. I dragged him up. I locked him in the cell. And then I went home. Caleb closed his eyes. The memory was a physical pain. I was shaking. Not because of the fight, because of how much I had wanted to hit him, how much I had held back. I thought I had controlled myself. I thought I had done my job. He opened his eyes. He looked straight into Eliza's soul. In the morning, he couldn't stand up. He couldn't focus his eyes. Doc Harlan said it was a bleed in the brain. Doc said, if I had checked on him at midnight, if I had gone back at 2 in the morning, they might have drilled the skull. They might have saved him. Caleb let out a long, ragged breath. He died 3 days later. His wife didn't come to the jail. Nobody came. I sat with him the last night, because nobody else would. He leaned back in the chair. He looked utterly defeated. I have not forgiven myself for any of the 100 choices I made that week. Not one. Eliza didn't cry. She didn't scream. She looked at the broken man sitting across from her. She asked the only question that mattered. If you could go back, Caleb, knowing what he did, would you still arrest him? Yes, Caleb said without hesitation, because 20 families lost their land. Even knowing he would die? I didn't know he would die. I only knew he was wrong. I was supposed to stop what was wrong. I did it with too much anger. I did it without enough care. And I have spent 4 years asking myself if those two things make me a murderer, or just a man who failed. He looked at her, his eyes begging for an answer he couldn't give himself. I still don't know. Eliza let the blanket drop from her shoulders. She stood up. She walked over to his chair. She didn't stand above him. She knelt down on the braided rug right in front of him. "You're not a murderer, Caleb," she said quietly. "And you're not innocent. You're a man who did his job with a broken heart, and it cost someone else everything." She reached out. She took his rough, scarred hands in hers. "Robert is dead because of choices he made," she said, "and because of a choice you made. Both things are true. I spent 4 years trying to make one of them true and the other one false. Because it's easier to hate a monster than it is to forgive a man." She squeezed his hands. "My brother was not a saint. When he came to see me in Denver, I knew he was lying. I lent him $200 anyway. He used my money to stay afloat while he sold that fake land. 3 more families bought from him because I gave him that money." Caleb stared at her. "Eliza, I have never told anyone that," she whispered. "For 4 years I pretended I was just the grieving sister, but I helped him do it, with too much love and not enough courage." She looked down at their joined hands. "So here is the truth we share, Caleb Dunn. You killed my brother with too much force, and I helped my brother ruin 20 families with too much silence." She looked back up. Her eyes were fierce. "Neither of us is innocent. Neither of us is a monster. We are just 2 people who failed the people we were supposed to protect. And we have been running from that failure for 4 years." Caleb's voice broke. "What do we do now?" "We tell the truth," Eliza said. "All of it, in court. And then we let the judge decide what justice looks like. I am not equipped to make that decision anymore. And neither are you." The next 2 weeks were a blur of paper and ink. They didn't act like lovers. They acted like soldiers preparing for a siege. Eliza used her skills. She didn't audit Caleb's books. She audited Robert's crimes. She wrote to Jonathan Greer. She compiled a list of the 20 families. She documented their losses. Caleb wrote his affidavit. He didn't ask for mercy, he just wrote the facts. Doc Harlan agreed to testify, both to the medical facts and to Caleb's character. But the hardest part fell to Eliza. 2 days before the trial, she rode back into Cedar Flat. She knocked on Clara's door a second time. She didn't bring apologies. She brought the ledger. She sat at Clara's table and she opened the book. "Robert wronged these people, Clara," Eliza said gently. "That is on his soul. And you can hate Caleb Dunn for his part in Robert's death. You have that right. But you need to know what our brother did before you ask a judge to put Caleb in a cage. You need to know exactly what kind of grief you are defending." Clara read the pages. She read the names of the families. She read the amounts they lost. It took her 2 hours. When she finished, she closed the book. She pressed her hand over her mouth. "I don't want him in prison," Clara wept. "I never wanted that. I just wanted someone to say Robert's name out loud and not pretend he was only a villain. I wanted someone to acknowledge that he was complicated, that he did a terrible thing, but his death still mattered. I've been asking this town to hold both truths at once for 4 years, and they won't do it." Eliza reached across the table. She took her sister's hand. "A courtroom will do it, Clara," Eliza said. "We will make them." The night before the trial, the snow had stopped. The sky was clear and bitterly cold. The stars looked like chips of ice. Caleb and Eliza stood on the back porch. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Caleb said, his breath pluming in the air, "I need you to know something." "What?" Caleb looked at her. Really looked at her. "The best thing that ever came from the worst thing I ever did was you walking through my door." Eliza swallowed hard. "I walked through your door to destroy you." "I know," Caleb said softly. "And you ended up being the only person who bothered to find out who I actually was. Not the town, not Doc. Just you. You did the one thing I needed someone to do. And you did it even though you hated me for it." He stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her skin. "I don't know what you call that," he whispered, "but it's the closest I've ever come to being seen." Eliza didn't answer with words. She just reached out in the cold, dark night and rested her hand against his chest, right over his heart. She felt it beating, steady, strong, alive. Tomorrow they would face the law. Tomorrow they would face the town. But tonight, for the first time in 4 years, neither of them was standing in the dark alone. November 21st, 1882. They held the trial in the livery barn. Cedar Flat didn't have a courthouse. It was freezing. The air smelled like wet wool, manure, and chewing tobacco. Every bench was packed. Half the town was standing in the back. Doc Harlan was there, Jesse Ward, Harold Whitaker from the bank, Mrs. Pruitt. Judge Elias Parsons sat behind a makeshift table. He was an old man, face like a dried apple. He didn't wear a robe, just a heavy black suit. He banged a wooden mallet on the table. The room went dead quiet. The trial was fast. It didn't have the theatrics you read about in the penny dreadfuls. It was just brutal, methodical truth. Clara took the stand first. She didn't scream. She didn't point fingers. She just told the judge about her brother. She told him about the 4 years of silence, about how a town shouldn't sweep a man into a ditch just because he was a sinner. Doc Harlan went next. He laid out the medical facts, the blunt force, the hematoma. And then he looked right at Caleb. He told the judge about the man who had lived on that ridge for 4 years, the man who had punished himself more efficiently than any prison ever could. Then Caleb stood up. He walked to the front. He put his hand on the Bible. He told the room exactly how Robert Morrison died. He didn't leave out his anger. He didn't leave out the yank of the arm or the sound of Robert's head hitting the floor. He didn't make excuses. When he finished, you could hear a pin drop in the hay. Then the lawyer from Helena called Eliza. She walked to the front. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked at Judge Parsons. The lawyer paced in front of her. "Miss Morrison, please state your full name and your relationship to the deceased." "Eliza Margaret Morrison," she said, her voice carried clear to the back wall. "Younger sister of Robert Morrison." A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Parsons banged his mallet. "Did you come to Cedar Flat with the intention of gathering evidence against Mr. Dunn?" the lawyer asked. "Yes." "Did you purchase Mr. Dunn's bank debt to facilitate a civil claim contingent on establishing his guilt?" "Yes." The lawyer stopped pacing. He leaned in. "And in your investigation, Miss Morrison, did you find evidence that Caleb Dunn acted with criminal intent? Did he murder your brother?" Eliza finally looked at Caleb. He was sitting perfectly still, waiting for the axe to fall. "I did not," Eliza said. The crowd shifted. "I found evidence," Eliza continued, "that a peace officer carrying the grief of 20 ruined families made an arrest with too much force and too little care." She looked at Clara. "But I also found evidence that my brother Robert was not an innocent victim. He was a man who sold land he knew he didn't own. He sold it to people who couldn't afford to lose. Robert bore responsibility for the desperation that led him to resist arrest." She looked back to the judge. "Mr. Dunn did not murder my brother. My brother and Mr. Dunn between them failed each other on a single night, in a way neither of them can ever fix. That is what I found." She sat down. The room was silent. Judge Parsons called a 20-minute recess. When he came back, he didn't sit down. He stood behind the table. He looked over the crowd. He looked at Clara. He looked at Eliza. Finally, his eyes settled on Caleb. "Having heard the testimony," Judge Parsons said, his voice grating like stone on stone, "this court finds the evidence insufficient to support a charge of criminal homicide." Caleb closed his eyes. "The death of Robert Morrison," the judge continued, "is ruled an accident, compounded by negligence. That negligence was adjudicated in civil court 3 years ago. This court will not retry what Oregon has already settled. The petition is denied." Parsons pointed a gnarled finger at Caleb. "Mr. Dunn, rise." Caleb stood. "You are free," the judge said. "But freedom, sir, is not the same as innocence. You carry what you carry. The court cannot relieve you of that weight. Only you can." The judge leaned forward. "Robert Morrison's family has spoken. They do not require your destruction. Do them the courtesy of accepting their verdict, even if you cannot accept your own. Court is adjourned." The mallet fell. The crowd broke apart. People bundled up, walked out into the snow. Eliza didn't wait for Caleb. She slipped out the side door. She walked straight down the boardwalk to the post office. Mrs. Pruitt wasn't smiling today. She just pushed 2 stamped envelopes across the counter. Eliza dropped the first letter into the slot. It was addressed to the First Bank of Cedar Flat. Inside was Caleb's promissory note, signed, notarized, canceled in full. He didn't owe her $340 anymore. He didn't owe Whitaker. He owned his land free and clear. She had just surrendered the only power she had over him. She held the second envelope. It was addressed to Jonathan Greer in Denver. Inside were instructions. Absolute, legally binding instructions. The $2,147 sitting in Caleb's Portland account, the blood money, plus $500 of Eliza's own savings. It wasn't coming to her. It was being transferred into a trust, divided equally, sent directly to the 20 families in Oregon who had lost their land to Robert Morrison. She dropped the envelope into the slot. It was done. It wasn't about love conquering all. It was about choosing to do the right thing, even if it destroyed the very thing you were trying to build. She knew Caleb would be furious. She knew it might be the end of them. She walked out into the snow, and she headed back to the ranch. Late afternoon. The sky was the color of lead. Caleb was by the barn, pitching fresh hay to the horses. Eliza walked up. The snow crunched under her boots. He stopped. He leaned on the pitchfork. "Caleb," she said, "I need to tell you something I did." She didn't sugarcoat it. She just told him. The banknote, the lawyer, the money in Portland, all of it. Caleb stared at her. For the first time since she met him, he looked truly, terrifyingly angry. He threw the pitchfork. It slammed into the barn wall and clattered to the dirt. "You had no right," Caleb snarled. He stepped toward her. "That money was mine. That decision was mine. Those families, I was going to find a way to reach them. In my time, in my way." Eliza didn't back up. "4 years, Caleb," she fired back. "You've had 4 years. You chose cold winters. You chose thin soup. You chose to let that money sit in a vault while you convinced yourself you didn't deserve to use it." She stepped into his space. "You weren't going to reach them. You were going to die with that money untouched, and those families were going to stay ruined. I took the choice out of your hands." "You don't get to decide my penance for me," he shouted. "And you don't get to punish yourself forever," Eliza shouted back. "At some point, you have to stop paying for being alive. Those families didn't want your suffering, Caleb. They wanted their land back. They can't have the land, but they can have this." She pointed a finger at his chest. "The only reason you refuse to give it to them is because giving it to them would mean you get to start healing, and you're not sure you're allowed to heal. Well, I'm telling you right now, you are allowed. I am giving you the permission. Take it." Caleb breathed hard. His chest heaved. The anger radiated off him like heat from a stove. "You lied to me for 10 weeks, he said. His voice was a low growl. "Yes. You came here to destroy me. Yes. And then you went behind my back and gave away my money. Yes?" Caleb stared at her. "Why should I ever trust a single thing you say or do?" Eliza held his gaze. She didn't flinch. "You shouldn't," she said quietly. "Trust is earned. I haven't earned it yet. But I am asking you, not demanding, asking, for the chance to start earning it, today, tomorrow, for however long it takes." Caleb didn't answer right away. The wind whipped between them. The snow fell in the space separating them. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. And slowly the silence between them stopped feeling like a weapon. It started to feel like a truce. 1 week later, Monday morning, pitch black. freezing cold. Caleb walked out the back door. He headed toward the smokehouse. He heard footsteps behind him, lighter boots, crunching in the snow. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He reached the unmarked grave. The snow was piled high on the river stone. He brushed it off with his gloved hand. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a sprig of dried winterberry, red against the white snow. He set it on the stone. Eliza stepped up beside him. She reached into her coat. She pulled out a pressed pink wildflower. She had found it in Mrs. Halloway's greenhouse in town. She set it on the stone, right next to the winterberry. "I'll do this with you," Eliza said. Her voice was quiet in the dark. "Every Monday, until we both feel like we've said enough." Caleb looked at the two flowers. "That might take a long time," he said. "I know." "I don't forgive you for lying to me," he said. "I know. I don't know if I ever will. Completely." Eliza looked at him. "I know that too." Caleb turned his head. He looked at her face, pale in the moonlight. "But I'd like you to stay," he said softly, "while I figure it out." Eliza nodded. "I'll stay." They didn't embrace. They didn't kiss. The movies always get that wrong. Real healing doesn't happen in a sudden rush of music. It happens in the quiet choice to stand next to someone in the cold. They turned. They walked back to the cabin. They didn't hold hands, but they walked close enough that every few steps, their shoulders brushed. And for now, that was enough. They didn't have a wedding that first winter, or the winter after. Eliza moved her things out of the side room, but not into Caleb's room. When the ground thawed in the spring, Caleb built a second cabin, 200 yards from his own, connected by a covered wooden walkway. They shared meals. They shared the work of the ranch. They shared the long, quiet evenings. They did not share a bed, not for 2 years. Some things, Caleb had told her, have to be earned slowly. Eliza agreed. Neither of them was in a hurry to skip the part where they learned each other fully. They had both tried to skip that part before in different ways, and it had nearly destroyed them. They were married in December of 1884. The Methodist preacher rode out on horseback through knee-deep snow. Eliza wore a dark wool dress she had sewn herself. Caleb wore the same white cotton shirt he wore every Sunday. There were no grand vows, no poetry, just two people who had seen each other at their absolute worst, who had lied to each other, hurt each other, uncovered each other's ugliest truths, and decided, with their eyes wide open, to build a life together anyway. The 20 families in Oregon received their settlement checks over the next 2 years. 3 of them wrote back. One of them, a Mrs. Abernathy, sent Eliza a single pressed wildflower. The letter was short. It said, "My children sleep in a house again. Thank you." Eliza kept that letter tucked inside the family Bible until the day she died. Clara Dunlop remarried a widower from Helena in 1886 and moved east. She and Eliza exchanged letters every Christmas. They never became close, but they never stopped writing either. Some bonds are not friendships. They are simply the unbreakable shape of shared grief. Caleb kept visiting Robert Morrison's grave every single Monday. He did it until the winter of 1919, when he died quietly in his sleep at the age of 71. By then, the grave wasn't unmarked. Eliza had ordered a proper granite headstone from Denver, and wildflowers grew thick around the base of it, without anyone needing to plant them. Eliza passed away 4 years later. She was buried beside Caleb on the ridge, and per her written request, both of their stones were angled slightly, facing Robert's. Some people build love on passion, some build it on need. Caleb and Eliza built theirs on something rarer, something infinitely harder, the willingness to be known, fully, terribly, completely known, and to stay anyway. That is the ending. That is what this story was always about. It wasn't about the secrets they kept or the lies they told. It wasn't even about the truth when it finally came to light. What mattered was what they did after the truth was out. What mattered was that they stayed. If this story taught us anything, it taught us this: the people we love most will someday disappoint us. They will keep things from us. They will make choices we do not understand. And the measure of love is not whether we are ever wounded by those we love. We will be. The measure of love is whether after the wound we choose to stay in the room, to keep listening, to forgive what we cannot forget, remember what we cannot change, and love what we can no longer pretend is perfect. That is the oath worth writing in ink. If this story moved you, if Caleb or Eliza or Clara reminded you of someone in your own life, take a moment right now. Hit that like button. Tell me in the comments, was there ever a truth in your own life that took years to come out? Did it bring you closer to someone or further apart? I read every single comment. And if you want more stories like this one, frontier stories where the heart matters more than the guns, subscribe and tap the bell. There's another one coming next week. Until then, be the kind of person who stays in the room.
Out here on the frontier, where the wind never stops talking and the land remembers every footprint, people like to believe that justice is simple, that a man is either good or he is evil, that a wrong can be balanced by a punishment, that a life can be measured, judged, and settled like numbers in a ledger. But this story, it refuses that kind of comfort, because what Caleb Dunn and Eliza Morrison found was something far more difficult to live with. The truth that a single moment, a single choice, can ripple outward and shape the lives of countless others. Caleb did his duty, but he did it with anger in his heart, and that anger cost a man his life. Eliza loved her brother, but she chose silence over courage, and that silence helped him destroy the lives of innocent families. Neither of them set out to become what they became. Neither of them woke up one morning and chose to be the villain in someone else's story. And yet, here they are, two souls carrying a weight that cannot be undone. And maybe that is the first lesson this story leaves us with, that life is not divided between the righteous and the guilty. Most of us live somewhere in between, in that quiet, uncomfortable place where love and failure exist side by side. The second lesson is harder. It asks something of us. It asks us to look at the people we judge, truly look at them, and consider the full shape of their story. Not just the worst thing they've done, but the reasons behind it, the regrets that followed, and the quiet ways they've tried to make things right. Caleb didn't run from his guilt. He built his life around it. Every cold morning, every empty comfort he denied himself, every flower laid on that grave. It was his way of saying, I remember. I will not pretend this didn't happen. And Eliza, she came seeking justice, but what she really found was herself. She was forced to confront a truth she had buried deep. That love, when it lacks courage, can become complicity. That doing nothing can sometimes carry the same weight as doing wrong. And in facing that truth, she did something far braver than revenge. She chose honesty. That may be the most important lesson of all. That truth, no matter how painful, is the only thing strong enough to build a future on. Because lies, whether we tell them to others or to ourselves, have a way of hollowing us out. They give us temporary comfort, but they steal our chance at peace. Only when Caleb and Eliza laid everything bare, every mistake, every regret, every hidden wound, did they finally step out of the shadows they had been living in for years. And there is something else this story teaches, something quieter, but just as powerful. That redemption is not a moment. It is a choice we make, again and again, in the way we live afterward. Caleb could not bring Robert back. Eliza could not undo the damage her brother caused. But together, they chose to face the truth, to honor the people who had been hurt, and to stop running. And in doing so, they proved that even a life shaped by mistakes can still hold meaning, dignity, and even, if we are brave enough to accept it, a chance at connection. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.